The Japanese reacted too slowly, and instead of attacking the main for formation when it was still outside anti-aircraft gun range, they waited for the formation to break up, and when it did not, they found themselves in the position of flying into their own flak. So the effectiveness of the fighters in stopping the strike before it began was minimal. The ships were caught unaware one was fueling, but by the time the attack was launched, the shore and ship guns were putting up a hellish field of fire that the Americans had to fly through. The result was a scattered attack, and no Japanese ships were sunk, but that does not tell the real story. So much damage was done to the cruisers that they were withdrawn from the Banville operation, the heavy cruiser. Mami was hit by only one bomb, but it damaged her so badly that she had to be sent back to Japan for repairs. The bomb penetrated below decks and started a number of fires, and the major damage was to the hull engine rooms and one magazine. 19 men were killed and 41 wounded. The cruiser M took one bomb in the port engine room through her main stack, and she had to be towed back to truck. That remarkable delivery of bombs was made by Lieutenant Commander James Newell, leader of the Saratoga's dive bombers. The Mears casualties were heavy, 70 men killed and 60 wounded. The cruiser TOA was hit twice and a hole below the waterline on her starboard bow, and damaged steering meant she too would have to go into dry dock. Her casualties were 23 men dead and 22 wounded. The cruiser Atago was damaged by 3 near misses, and the destroyer Wakatsuki was also damaged by near misses. The light cruiser Agano was damaged by bombs that knocked out her forward turret and wounded 11 men. The light cruiser Noshiro was hit by a torpedo, apparently a dud, which wounded 14 men. The destroyer Fujinami was slightly damaged by a dud torpedo, which wounded 13 men, and most of the damage was done by the dive bombers. The Americans were having a great deal of trouble with their torpedoes, aerial and undersea. In fact, for the amount of effort expended, the torpedo squadrons produced very little, except when they were using bombs instead of torpedoes. The reasons were two: an inferior exploding device and a poor system of drop control. The following year, the latter would be remedied in part by development of control devices that kept the torpedoes from skipping or submarining when dropped at high speed at low. Altitude altogether, however, torpedo plane performance was a disappointment, and it had nothing to do with the skill or willingness of the pilots. Another problem on November 5th was that there were too many targets for the planes involved. As it was, the Americans lost 5 fighters and 5 bombers. They could thank the aircraft designers and builders for a number of lives saved that day. Many of the American planes arrived back on the carriers so badly shot up, it seemed remarkable that they got home. Lieutenant H.M. Crockett of the Princeton was wounded, but brought his F-6F fighter back to the carrier and landed the Aries aircraft handlers counted 200 holes in the aircraft. Commander Caldwell, who directed the operation from above, was attacked by Zeros. One of his crewmen was killed and the other wounded, and his gun turret went out. So did the radio, and one air on the flaps and one wheel. Still, he got the torpedo bomber back to the Saratoga. As to the attack from the Japanese point of view, it had completely destroyed a major effort to shore up the defense of Rabaul, as the Imperial General Staff's history noted. For some reason, the southeast area reinforcements efficiency was lacking that same day, since many of the ships had not been in port for 24 hours. The force was withdrawn to True, and again, in the words of the Imperial General Staff, no profit resulted. The Japanese that day attempted to recoup, somewhat at least, by getting at the carriers. The 11th Air Fleet sent out a number of torpedo bombers, but they did not find the American carriers. Instead, they found a small force consisting of PT-67 Landing Craft Infantry 70 and Tank Landing Craft 68 on their way south from the Torokina beachhead. The Japanese planes attacked and damaged the ships, but did not sink any of them because the V vessels were so small the torpedoes passed under their keels. The landing craft infantry had the unique experience of having a purposing torpedo bounce into the engine room and still not explode. One man was killed by the impact, but the torpedo sat there smoking and still not exploding. The men of the landing craft infantry abandoned ship. But when the ship remained afloat, eventually they reclaimed her and got her back under tow to Torokina. The Japanese pilots who returned to Rabaul from this action claimed to have sunk one carrier and set fire to a second, which sank later. They also claimed 2 heavy cruisers and 1 light cruiser and a destroyer. These claims are not mentioned in the official Japanese history of the war because there was not a shred of truth to them. The American pilots were prone to exaggeration in the heat of the moment, but at no time did they ever claim so much when so little had been accomplished. Those torpedo bombers had not even sunk a row and had lost at least 2 of their number in the one-sided fight against 3 small craft, when the results of the Rabaul strike were in. Admiral Sherman could announce that he had accomplished all this with the loss of only 10 planes. Admiral Halsey was delighted. He had expected heavy losses, and had also put those carriers at risk by moving them so close to Rabaul. The gamble had paid off magnificently. Admiral Koga had been planning to use those heavy ships to break up the Torquemada landing. He had nothing left that he wanted to risk, and by the time he thought it over more, the Gilbert's landing was in progress, and he had a third major front to worry about. Just because Operation Roe had suffered a serious reverse did not mean that Admiral Koga had given up, or that the Southeast Area Command was surrendering Banville without a fight on November 2nd, after the counter-landing force had to turn back on the eve of the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay. 6th Division Headquarters sent a message to the 23rd Infantry at Moshi Guta on the southwest side of Bugville, ordering the immediate relief of the small garrison at Torquemada. Based on these orders, Colonel Shaki Hamu, the commander of the 23rd Regiment, decided to lead a detachment to arrive on the west side of the island not later than the afternoon of November 6th. Altogether, he had about 2,400 troops, but this initial detachment consisted of about 300 riflemen with artillery and machine gun squads that included knee mortars, 18 of them with 10 grenade rounds, each light and heavy machine guns. Each heavy machine gun had 7,400 rounds of ammunition and artillery that ranged from 75 MMP howitzers to 37 guns. When the rescue operation was set up, it was planned that there would be plenty of supplies for these troops. The Army engineers had 4 Daihatsu barges in the area, and 5 days' supplies could be brought up on these, but on the morning of November 4th, Allied planes found the Datus and strafed them. Rendering all 4 to combat the troops would have to go into battle with a prayer and 2.5 days of iron rations that wasn't going to stop them, the colonel. Disappeared on the banks, and in the water the colonel ordered the men into the water to swim across. But one of the first men to put his foot in ran into trouble. A log moved, there was a small splash, and then a large one, a scream. The water turned pink for a moment, and then the swirls disappeared as the crocodile dragged its prey to the bottom. Fighting the enemy was one thing, but being eaten by crocodiles was something else, and the troops balked at trying to forward the river. The engineers came to the rescue with rubber boats and feared the men of the unit across. Next came the crossing of the Kogi River, which once more they found to be too deep to ford, and again the boats were employed. By this time darkness had fallen, and they moved through the blackness, stumbling and sliding, until at 10 o'clock they reached Noboy village on the right bank of the Kurogi River, and sank down exhausted. At dawn, the seashore was clearly indicated by the captive balloons that the Americans were flying above their bridgehead to discourage Japanese strafing. The air was full of American planes orbiting around the beachhead, and every time the unit moved, they got strafed. Finally, they gave up attempts to move forward for the moment. At this stage, Colonel Hamu was not at all confident of the success of the coming assault. Events certainly bore out his feelings of concern. Colonel Hamu was to await the coming of reinforcements before launching his attack. They were to arrive early on the morning of November 6th by sea, and these were the first 1,000 troops of the counter-landing force. Another 2,000 men would come along later, and this detachment was the No. 2 Kenbai, that unit of shock troops with long experience on the China front. They were the troops scheduled to land on November 1st, who had been turned back by order of Admiral Sami Jima, when the Amori force discovered the presence of what the admiral thought was a very powerful American fleet. The No. 2 Kenpai had returned to Rabaul at that time. In fact, they were lucky because no one had told the officers where they were going or what they were going to do, and they were brand new in the South Pacific. The Commander Major Mitsuhiro Miwa and his officers took the next few days for intensive training in the tactics of jungle warfare, which gave the men a new confidence. On November 5th, the orders had come again: board the destroyer transports and prepare to land on Banville. The plan was precisely the same as the last one, but on November 5th, Admiral Samima made a change in the destroyer command, a result of the poor performance of the destroyers at Empress Augusta Bay. So the move was again delayed. The attack was to be at night on November 6th, but then the word came from Banville that Colonel Hu's force was being eaten by crocodiles and otherwise delayed, and so the attack was again postponed. The No. 2 Ken Bai finally boarded the destroyers on the morning of November 6th and sailed from Rabaul at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Lieutenant Colonel Hanano of the staff of the East Area Army went along as liaison officer with the Navy. They would land that night and attack at dawn. As it turned out, the destroyers did not reach Banville until the early hours of the morning, and then the destroyer commander decided he would lie offshore about 2 miles. He had been involved in the Column Bangara reinforcement operations, and that was the way they did it there. But a reinforcement of friendly troops and a landing on an enemy beach were two different matters, and the army men protested that they were being thrown to the wolves. This meant more discussions before the destroyers finally moved in a little closer. So much for inter-service cooperation. Lieutenant Colonel Hisano watched anxiously through his field glasses as the landing boats moved off toward the beach. Only when the signal flare that showed a safe landing went up did he relax. He sent a message then to East Area Army Headquarters at Rabaul, announcing the safe landing of the troops at Rabaul. When the message was received, General Imamura heaved a sigh of relief, gave thanks to the Emperor, and sent a message to Imperial General Headquarters. But from that moment on, radio contact with the detachment was spotty at 7 a.m. on November 7th. The Navy reported that the landing seemed to be successful, but the landing force still had not been heard from by 5 o'clock in the evening. The detachment still had not been heard from. The first word came through a radio intercept at 8:35 p.m. An American message was picked up reporting that the enemy was on the left, and that about 15 datus had been seen on the northern beach near the mouth of the Ruma River. The message requested an immediate airstrike after that. Nothing. The No. 2 Ken Bai landed in 3 sections. The main force of about 650 men landed near the east bank of the Kurumu River, the second group the 5th Company of the 54th. Infantry, about 100 men in all, landed near the Kakei River's west bank, the 6th Company of the 54th Infantry. 100 men with a field gun and 2 machine guns landed near the Cuo stream. Major Miwa directed the landing energetically and then went off to join the main force. The 3 forces never did get back together again, and almost immediately following orders, the No. 2 Ken Bai rushed into stage, a surprise attack on the American side. The 4 Japanese destroyers were seen coming in, and landing craft was seen to debark and begin to load men and then come into shore just east of the Luma River. They were seen. But since warships in the dark look the same even to Navy men, and American landing craft and Japanese landing craft looked much alike, no one paid attention until it was too late to stop them from getting ashore. But in the hurry to get ashore, the Japanese scattered over a wide section of the beach. They also ran into the problem that had bothered the Marines in the first landing swamp and jungle. Thus they could not immediately concentrate their forces for attack Company K of the 9th. Marines was holding this flank dug in between swamp and sea. 1 platoon was patrolling upland along the Luma River. The Marines saw about 50 troops landing from 2 boats some 400 yards away. But what was happening did not sink in for a few minutes. And then the Japanese attacked. The Marines drove them off. The Japanese moved into the swamp and disappeared when Lieutenant Colonel Walter South, Jr., commander of the 9th Marines 3rd Battalion, got the message about the attack. He ordered Company K to counterattack and called also for mortar and artillery support. The Marines attacked at 8:20 a.m. and moved west about 150 yards before they ran into the Japanese, who had already dug in. The Japanese had light and heavy machine guns, and soon they had the left platoon of Company K pinned down the centre, and right platoon tried to come around and insert CLE the Japanese, but they were slowed down by the same thick jungle that had given Colonel Hammond's men such a hard time. the Marine advance wasn't helped by the fact that in some rearrangement of the perimeter, other Marines had left entrenched positions that the Japanese now occupied the Japanese ashore, gave fire cover to more troops who came ashore in landing craft, and soon they had all 3 platoon of Company K pinned down the fighting, then slowed to a sharp shooting match 5. Marines were killed and 13 wounded by 1:15 p.m. when the 1st Battalion of the 3rd Marines was ordered to attack and the Mold Company K was withdrawn. The fighting now became a slugging match, and the Marines advanced foot by foot behind grenades, machine gun fire and mortars. The Japanese threw the grenades back sometimes and added their own knee mortar shells. The Japanese machine gunners gave ground slowly and reluctantly, one gun covering another. Sergeant Herbert J. Thomas of Company B saw that his squad was held up by a Japanese machine gun. He gathered the men and told them what he was going to do, and he would get up and throw a grenade into the machine gun nest. The men were to wait for the explosion and then pour small arms fire into the position. But when Thomas threw his grenade, it arched too high, got caught in a vine hanging from the trees above, and fell down among the Marines. Thomas leapt forward and smothered the grenade with his body as it exploded, thus saving the lives of at least most of his squad, for that his family received his posthumous Congressional Medal of Honor. The Japanese soon had 200 men ashore in this sector, and the machine guns caused plenty of trouble for the Marines, and had much of Company B pinned down. Seeing this, Captain Gordon Warner, the commander of Company B, got a helmet full of grenades and found a tank to help knock out the machine guns. Warner had since studied Japanese, and had an idiomatic command of the language with the tank behind. He led his riflemen to the Japanese position, then began issuing orders in Japanese yukendeyas, meaning fixed bayonets, and then he said Techo Jim, which means annihilate the enemy. The Japanese soldiers, unaware of the source of the orders, dutifully followed them. They fixed bayonets and charged forth into the steady rifle fire of the Marine riflemen. Warner moved forward. Time after time got the Japanese attention by shouts that confused them and hurled his grenades. The tank came along and cleaned up before the afternoon was over. Captain Warner and the tank had knocked out 6 machine gun posts. He was wounded in the leg and later traded it for a Navy Cross awarded, because the Marines knew that his action had let them build up a firing line and prevent the infiltration of the Marine positions. That day the patrol up the Luma River got into TR trouble. Before the afternoon was over, it was attacked and withdrew to the east. Its members came back within the Marine lines that evening. Then, the outpost platoon of Company M on the beach was hit by Japanese coming from the Luma River. What seemed to be a company of Japanese attacked, and soon had the Marines pinned on 3 sides. Help came up from the beach in the form of Lieutenant Frank Nolander of the Navy, who brought a pair of amphibious landing craft up to the position and evacuated the besieged patrol. He got 60 Marines out without losing a man, and by evening the Japanese had taken over the extreme west side of the beach from the Luma River to a point about a mile to the east. They had also driven a wedge between Marine positions, and thus surrounded the 1st Platoon of Company B of the 3rd Marines. The Marines set up a perimeter and held their position through the long night, and at dawn they moved back and made it to the Marine lines, as Colonel Hamu had feared the seaborne counter-landing had failed to drive through the American lines. Though the No. 2 Kenpai was fighting now for its existence, its only hope was to fight through to Colonel Hui's unit, given the results. General Imamura called off the next wave of landings in the bay, and the 2,500 additional troops were not committed. The only decent trail in the whole Empress Augusta Bay region of Banville was the P Trail that more or less followed the P River from the southeast toward the mission area, where the Marines had taken up temporary residence. The Marines had set up a roadblock across the P Trail about a mile from the beach, and had held it against sporadic Japanese attack by the remnants of the Torina detachment on the night of November 6th. Colonel Hamu had bivouac on the east side of the PVR. The next day he moved down to a point opposite the roadblock, and early in the morning he crossed the river. He was to coordinate his attack from the inland side with that of the troops coming into the beach. But alas, from the Japanese point of view, the troops coming into the beach never got very far, and although Colonel Hamu attacked at 2:30 in the afternoon to drive through and meet them, the attack was repelled, he backed off until the next day and retreated to dig in west of P village. The situation had developed in a most unpleasant way, and the brave plan for a breakthrough on the first day had failed, but that did not mean the colonel had quit. The night was punctuated by a continual mortar barrage levied against the Marines in the trail block positions. At 7:30 in the morning, the colonel led his men out to attack. The fighting was fierce for 7 hours, until the Marines brought up reinforcements and pushed the Japanese back again. The colonel was bothered most by the Marin big guns, which seemed to follow his men wherever they went, and kept him constantly off base on November 7th. In the afternoon, the Japanese had broken through the Marine lines at the roadblock, but when the colonel sent a new wave against the position, the Marine artillery had broken up his attack, and he had been forced to give it up on the 8th before launching his morning attack. Colonel Hamu had tried to respond in kind with a 4-hour mortar preparation for his attack, but it was not the same. His infantrymen had been forced to fight for every foot of the advances they made that day, and then to hold against a determined Marine counterattack, but they had held, and it was the artillery that made the difference. That night the colonel considered a plan to drive on through the Marine lines to reach the anchorage and destroy the artillery there. But Major Tanaka, his intelligence officer, looked over the plan and sent out a small patrol, and then announced that it would be extremely difficult mukashi desun, which, in the polite way that a subordinate talked to the colonel, meant that he was out of his head to try the trouble, was that the support from the seaward side had completely evaporated, and at Rabul and Imamura was not prepared to commit any more men to what he saw as an improbable situation, and it was down along the beach that the artillery operated on the night of November 8th. The Marines planned a new and heavier artillery barrage, and it began at 7:30 in the morning of November 9th. The 2nd Raider Battalion was chosen to make the new attack. Half an hour later it was slow, since Colonel Hu's troops fought every inch of the way at the end of an hour and a half. The Marines had progressed only 50 yards. The Marines brought up reinforcements and continued to press on, but the Japanese resisted, until suddenly at 12:30 p.m. they pulled out. Neither Rabul nor Colonel Hu's detachment picked up any messages from the No. 2 Ken Buhai that night, but during the night and in the morning Colonel Hu's men heard constant gunfire at 8 o'clock on the morning of November 8th. Hamu sent a message to 6th Division headquarters reporting in that the fighting seemed to be concentrated around the southwest entrance to the bay. There was no communication from the No. 2 Ken Bai during the remainder of that day. On the morning of November 8th, the Marines to the east of the Japanese thrust attacked to drive the enemy back to the beach and consolidate the line. The attack was preceded by an artillery barrage that killed an estimated 300 Japanese, and it was supported by light tanks when the assaulting troops moved forward to the Japanese positions. They found there were no living Japanese to oppose them. Then, on the night of November 9th, the Japanese received word that the No. 2 Ken Bai was in the middle of a battle, no more on November 10th. The remnants of the No. 2 Ken Buhai straggled into the Bibir River landing. The Hamu detachment had also pulled back out of sight. The Marines could not understand it, but they were not about to refuse a gift, so they moved on rapidly up the P trail. They saw that the Japanese had inexplicably left everything behind: machine guns, mortars, and even rifles. They saw a large number of casualties. By 3:00 p.m. they had reached the junction of the Piva and Numa trails and had not caught sight of AIV Japanese for more than an hour. They stopped, dug in, and consolidated their position's security. Patrols sent out in front discovered a large bivouac area empty. They encountered some Japanese stragglers moving back along the Numa trail, but that was all the Marines had lost. 12 men and 30 were wounded, and they counted 100 Japanese bodies in the area. The reason for the Japanese pullback continued to puzzle them, but the reason was simple enough. On the night of November 8th, a discouraged Colonel Hamu had assessed his situation during the past 48 hours. The Americans had enlarged their perimeter, and the beachheads seemed to be established beyond the possibility of destruction. The failure of the seaborne attack had certainly shown that much, and the Americans held the only usable trail. Their concentration of artillery seemed to be growing, and the guns were firing faster, much as he might admire this as a professional. Soldier admired a good job well done. He decided to move back to escape the shelling. He did move that very evening from the old bivouac, and did escape the night shelling in the morning. The colonel prepared to launch a new attack. Then from the P-trail came a message from the commander of his 1st Battalion. The enemy's morning artillery barrage and airstrike had caught the entire heavy weapons section in their bivouac on the trail, and had virtually wiped the section off the face of the earth. The casualties were very heavy, and virtually every weapon and much of the ammunition had been destroyed. The Japanese situation was serious to the point of desperation. It would take days for a round trip back to base to Sisi-Yuri. A new supply of ammunition for the machine guns and mortars, and not only had most of the ammunition for these heavy weapons been destroyed, but the ammunition carriers were then handling much of the supply for the riflemen. The artillery barrage had not caught the Japanese, who were immediately opposite the Marines, so when the morning attack had begun, those Japanese soldiers in the front line had fought with their usual tenacity. So had the Marines. Private First Class, Henry Gurkha and Private First Class. Donald Props were sharing a foxhole on the front of the line. The Japanese discovered them first thing in the morning and began to pour machine gun fire into the position they followed that. With grenades, 2 Marines in the next hole were killed, but Gurkha and Propst hung on the firing grew more intense. Gurkha observed that Propst's Browning automatic rifle was a damned sight more effective under these circumstances than his M1, and that if anything happened, such as a grenade falling into their hole, he would take care of it. While Propst continued to fire, suddenly a grenade landed squarely between them, and without hesitation, Private First Class Gurkha threw himself onto the grenade and smothered it so that Propst could continue to fire and hold the position Propst did, and won the Silver Star. Gurkha's relatives received his Congressional Medal of Honor, as had Sergeant Thomas's. The Japanese fought like tigers until those grenade hurlers began to run out of ammunition and sent the word back. The runner returned with the answer that there was no ammunition for the machine guns, and there were no grenades. The Japanese suddenly fell back, so the pullback had been a result of the enormously effective artillery barrage. The Marines were not giving enough credit to their own guns, and the Marines planned to attack again the next day, November 10th, before moving out. They waited for a 15-minute artillery barrage and an airstrike, and these were both delivered by 9:45 in the morning of November 10th. When the riflemen began to move ahead, there was no resistance, and as the Marines moved on toward P Village, they saw that the Japanese had left equipment, ammunition, and even some rifles behind as they moved out. These were the weapons destroyed or damaged in the previous day. Shelling before noon, the Marines had moved into P Village, where they stopped and established a new position. The Battle of the Paiva Trail seemed to be over, and once again on the night of November 9th, the Japanese commander considered his problem. What nagged him was that the artillery made all the difference, and on a ratio basis the American firepower outdid him by 150 to 1. He was convinced that without this discrepancy in firepower, he could defeat the Americans. He could have worked his theory all out on paper, and that was all very nice. But the discrepancy in firepower was going to continue by the end of the first week of the invasion of Banville. The Americans were bringing in fresh troops. The Army 37th Infantry Division was slated to take over at Banville as soon as possible. Parts of the Army 148th Infantry arrived on November 8th, the 21st. Marines began to come in on November 11th, and the Army 129th Infantry began arriving on November 13th. The troops down below on the beach began building roads up into the hills. Until the roads were completed, only tracked vehicles could start for the front lines, with much hope of getting there through the mud and swamp. If they could get as far as P Village, they could go on, for the ground hardened there. But up the P River, Colonel Hamu and his men still held their defensive positions, while the colonel worried about the artillery and the inequality of this war that had made his attack into a virtual slaughter. The point, as far as the Americans were concerned, was that the Japanese had to be pushed back far enough into the hills to prevent them from launching an attack on the vital airstrip once it was completed. To do that, General Roy Geiger, the new Marine Commander General Vander, had just been promoted back to Washington, decided to establish a powerful outpost at the junction of the Numa and East-West trails. This time the Marines neglected to start with an artillery barrage. It was a costly mistake. The Marine attack began at 7:30 in the morning of November 133. Company E of the 21st Marines moved up the Numa Numa Trail and ran smack into an ambush. The Japanese, as was their habit, were dug in. Once again, they had shown that remarkable ability to make the best of the terrain. Log blockhouses protected their heavy and light machine guns. The riflemen, given the Nemours, were scattered around the perimeter. The dugouts were deep and had overhead cover of logs. Most of the machine gun positions were augmented toward their own rear by interconnecting trenches, and all this had been done without bulldozers or cement or virtually any equipment at all, other than the infantrymen's entrenching tools. The defending troops had been able to obtain ammunition and automatic weapons from the 3rd Battalion of the Japanese 23rd Infantry, and they had many snipers in the trees. The Marines of Company E advanced without any knowledge of these defences. They began to take casualties. Company E called for help, and the 2nd Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Eustace R. Smoked O. came up with the battalion, and Company G was sent in to relieve the pressure on Company E. Company H was ordered to set up a mortaring operation with the 81 mortars. Major Glenn E. Fistel, the battalion executive officer, was sent up front to assess the situation. He saw that Company E was slowly being decimated by enemy fire. The answer, he figured, was artillery, and he called for it to focus on the east side of the trail, where the heaviest Japanese firepower seemed to be concentrated. But Battalion Commander Smoke was getting conflicting reports. Instead of believing his executive and setting up the firing pattern for the artillery, he came up to look for himself. By this time, Fistel was wounded. Company E was still being cut down, and no artillery was firing smoke, then ordered Company F to come up and relieve Company E, and Company F started off bravely, then slanted away and got lost. Nobody could find hide or hair of them. Company G was ordered to hold, and Company E sensing. A lull in the firing began to withdraw, leaving a big hole in the centre of the Marine line. Still, there was no artillery action. Lieutenant Colonel Smoke now became worried about the various companies and sent more officers out to find them. Still, no one but Major Fistel had thought about using the artillery. All the battalion officers who searched did not find Company F. They did find a big hole in the centre of the line between Company G and Company E. The battalion situation says the Marine history was precarious, and even now no one called for that artillery fire that Colonel Hamu hated so much. Lieutenant Colonel Smoke then ordered Company E back into the line to close up the gap. It was growing late, and the time had come to dig in, even though the position was terrible. So the Marines dug in at 4:30 in the afternoon. The search for the missing Company F continued down on the beach. The patient, our artillerymen, waited for information so they could begin firing. None came. Then Japanese infiltrators cut the telephone line, and Colonel Smoke was out of communication with the artillery and regimental headquarters. The evening went by without any artillery fire, and at 5 p.m. a bedraggled sergeant showed up at battalion headquarters to report that Company F had managed to march around behind the Japanese lines without being discovered, and was now worried about the situation. The platoon were all mixed up, and no one seemed to be giving any coherent orders. Lieutenant Colonel Smoke told the sergeant to go back and get the company, and he did. Perhaps miraculously, Company F marched back to the battalion command without getting decimated. The Japanese must have been stunned by it all during the night. Colonel Evans O. Ames, commander of the 21st Marines, came up to make a little sense out of the battlefront. He brought along the 2nd Raiders to protect supply and communications lines back to headquarters. He re-established communication with the artillery and set up a firing pattern for the next morning barrage on 3 sides of Smokey's battalion. He brought up tanks and called for an airstrike in the morning. In other words, the colonel did all the things that Colonel Hamu hated, which maybe should have been done in the beginning at 8 o'clock on the morning of November 14th. The airstrike was overhead waiting, but Colonel Smoke had patrols out, so the planes hung around and waited while he got them back in. The artillery obligingly fired smoke rounds right on target around the battalion to mark the areas where the planes should bomb and strafe, and the planes came down to do their work. 18 torpedo bomber fighters plastered the area with high explosive and machine gun bullets. Then Company E on the left and Company G on the right were supposed to step out in attack with Companies F and H in reserve, A platoon of 5 medium tanks would lead the way each hour was set for. 11 a.m. and at 10:45 a.m. the telephone wires to the regiment broke down again, for reasons that will become apparent. It seems likely the Japanese had a hand in it. The attack had to be delayed at 11:15 a.m. The wires were re-established. H hour was moved back to 11:55 a.m. The 12th Marinese. Splendid artillery promised a 20-minute preparation and then a rolling barrage at 11:50 a.m. The attackers moved out the Japanese PED in a rain of heavy machine gun fire, light machine gun fire and mortar rounds. The tankers became confused and turned. They ran over a number of Marines and they began firing at positions. The trouble was they were Marine positions. Colonel Smoke decided the whole problem was the artillery barrage, which was confusing the troops, so he stopped it. He moved forward and halted the advance while he straightened out his officers and reorganized the assault. The Japanese were thoroughly confused by these irregular tactics and stopped shooting while they tried to figure out what the enemy was up to. Colonel Smoke issued orders to all company commanders to stand fast and send out patrols to see what the Japanese were up to. The tanks were sent back into reserve before they could kill any more Marines. 2 of them could not go. They had been knocked out by Japanese anti-tank guns. And where were these guns? They were behind the Marine lines. It seems that the Marines and the tanks, in all the confusion, had overrun the Japanese lines without knowing it, and now they faced pockets of resistance behind their front that seems to have accounted for the several breaches in communication lines. Several squads of riflemen had to be detailed to find and wipe out the Japanese positions. With grenades, they did so very effectively, using dogs who sniffed out the positions and then waited while the riflemen blew them up. Meanwhile, the Japanese facing the Marines moved out, and when the American advance was resumed at 2:15 p.m., it moved ahead without much trouble by 3:30 p.m. Lieutenant Colonel Smoke's men had achieved their objective, and they dug in for the night for 2 days. The reinforced battalion, supported by planes and artillery, had been fighting a single Japanese company. The Marines lost 20 men killed and wounded. They did not know how many Japanese they killed, but it was probably many fewer than the 40 they estimated. The fact is that this attack was an indication that Colonel Ham Manu was not talking through his hat when he said that, if it wasn't for the firepower, the Japanese 11th Air Fleet at Rabaul was largely responsible for the defense of that centre. During the stepped-up Allied air offensive, the 11th Air Fleet had been strengthened by November 1st for the Roe operation. The combined fleet's 3rd Air Group was called the Tiger Cubs, a name given for its ferocity in the air. That Air Group's 1st Squadron was informed on November 1st that it would go to Rabaul that very day. On November 2nd it arrived and flew 2 missions, and on November 3rd it flew 1 mission. On November 5th it went into the air to help with the defence of Rabaul. And when the fighting ended, this squadron had done very well for itself. Only 4 planes were lost, and the fighter pilots had accounted for several of the American attackers. The big raid on November 5th did not really slow down the 11th Air Fleet, but it did play hob with Admiral Koga's attempt to secure supremacy on the sea. Rabaul harbour was cleared of warships. The heavy cruiser. Maya remained in the harbour, but only because she could not move until internal repairs were made. The light cruiser Agano was still in harbour too, and for the same reason, but the only other fighting ships to remain were the light cruiser Yubari and several destroyers which had to be kept to protect, and sometimes to make the reinforcement and resupply missions. On November 6th, the Yubari and the destroyer Shiga were sent to Bua. General Imamura was following his orders. The Americans would not get any of these bases easily. This time the destroyer and light cruiser landed 700 men and 25 tons of supplies for the Bua base. The Americans were moving as quickly as they could to build those airstrips at Banville for land-based aircraft to use in attacking Rabaul. But in the interim, Admiral Holly had the use of another of Admiral Nimitz's carrier task forces. This one consisted of the new Essex, the Bunker Hill, and the light carrier Independence. That meant 5 carriers in all for the next air operation, which would occur on November 11th. In the meantime, Admiral Kusaka's 11th Air Fleet was continuing the air battle with all its resources from the Shortland. Island's lookout station on the morning of November 8th came a report to Japanese headquarters at Rabaul that a large force of Allied transports was heading north, obviously bound for the Torokina beachhead. The alert was sounded, and at 10:15 United States time that morning, a force of 710 fighters and 25 I-99 dive bombers set out for Banville. They arrived off Cape Torokina at noon and moved immediately to attack the convoy. Coming up consisted of the three big presidential liners that had brought the original contingent of troops they were bringing the first load of reinforcements and more supplies, and they were escorted by a number of sweepers and destroyers. The Japanese fighters and bombers managed to put 2 bombs into the President Jackson, causing some serious damage in the holds, and 25 casualties, 5 of them dead. Then the bombers were augmented by a force of Betty bombers, and they found Admiral Dubos's covering cruiser force, which consisted of 3 light cruisers and 4 destroyers. The cruiser Birmingham took 1 bomb that blew the hatch off her airplane hangar, another on a gun turret, and a torpedo in the bow she kept on going. The Japanese who returned to Rabaul announced that they had sunk 2 transports and 3 destroyers, badly damaged a cruiser, left another transport burning, and shot down 12 American planes, with another 2 probables. The Japanese losses, they said, were 10 bombers and 5 fighters, and 2 planes were damaged with this sort of reporting. It was impossible for Admiral Cogray or anyone else to have a real feel for the way the air battle was proceeding on November 11th. About 100 of Admiral Sherman's PLS from the Saratoga and the Princeton were launched near the Green Islands about 250 miles southeast of Rabaul. When they arrived over the target, it was overcast, and they did not get much of a look at the whole harbour, but there down below were the Yubari and 4 destroyers, and the American PLS attacked the Japanese, managed to duck in and out of rain clouds, and the attack was not a success. Admiral Mont-Ohm's 3 carriers launched about 185 planes against Rabaul. They had moved into a point about 160 miles southeast of the base for their attack. They ran into a surprise, and for some reason the Americans had developed a habit of underestimating Japanese air strength at Rabaul. They did not then understand the pipeline system, which kept a steady stream of aircraft funneling into the headquarters of the Southeast Area Command. The almost constant bombing of Rabaul was reported through the various commands, and as the Allied pilots returned day after day to report the destruction of 20, 30, 40 planes, the air intelligence officers had to believe that the Japanese strength at Rabaul was way down. In reality, on the 11th of November, the Japanese had 270 planes at Rabaul, and when the American airstrike reached the area, it was met by 68 Zeros. The fight that ensued was a fierce one, but this time the Americans did to the Zero what the Zeros had done so many times to the United States fighters. They lured the Japanese fighters into combat, and the dive bombers and torpedo bombers sneaked through to attack the harbour. The torpedo bombers performed better than they usually did. They put a torpedo into the crippled Ayano and knocked off her stern. They also damaged the destroyer, Naganami, and the dive bombers sank the destroyer Suzun. Nami, the Japanese, put up even more Zeros and chased the American attackers off the Zeros, then landed. Some of them would rearm and go off on the counterstrike against the American carrier force. At noon, the 11th Air Fleet launched its counterstrike about 150 planes. They were guided to the American task force by an orbiting Zero that had hung around all morning, in spite of the efforts of the Combat Air Patrol to get rid of it. They attacked, but the Combat Air Patrol and every fighter that could be moved off the decks of the 3 carriers got into the air. The fighters and the anti-aircraft gunners disposed of the majority of the Japanese planes that afternoon. At the end of the day, RAB's Air Force was again in disrepair, with only about 150 planes available. The Japanese pilots came home to Rabaul bragging that they had sunk a cruiser, damaged 2 carriers, and also damaged 3 other warships. There was not a word of truth in the claim they had not hit a single ship with a bomb or torpedo. Their one accomplishment about which they were ignorant is that they had forced the cancellation of the second American strike of the day against Rabaul. The worst casualty of that day's fighting for the Japanese was the loss of many. Example, at 4:21 a.m., a stick of bombs exploded alongside the destroyer Anthony without doing any damage. Somebody up there obviously identified her as one of the cruisers. and at 5:18 a.m. the destroyers Wadsworth and Anthony were attacked by torpedo planes. The men on deck saw at least 2 torpedoes dropped, but none hit the ships, nor were any tracks seen. The gunners were firing constantly and claimed to have shot down one plane. Those torpedo bombers, Betty bombers from Rabaul, were among the last of the attackers as the survivors winged off the light of false dawn was breaking, and it was not long before they were heading home when the pilots got there. They were again full of the most exaggerated tales. The Japanese propaganda machine claimed that the Imperial forces had sunk 5 battleships, 10 carriers, and 19 cruisers, plus dozens of other ships. The claims made fine propaganda for Tokyo and fine anti-Japanese propaganda for Washington. By this time at Rabaul, the reality of the row operation had begun to sink in, if so many American carriers and battleships had been sunk. Then, why were there still so many afloat? That was the sort of question that sensible Japanese officers were beginning to ask themselves. The fact was that the Japanese at every level were uncomfortably aware of the change in their fortunes in the past 6 months. They were losing the South Pacific campaign on the land, in the air, and on the sea, as Kolel Hamu put it, from his rough bivouac on the hillside above the Puma Puma Trail. Our advance was not on strong legs. How true, as of November 10th, the colonel assessed his casualties. He had lost 5 officers dead and 10 wounded, and he had lost 104 men killed and 184 wounded, whereas 40 men were missing, so the casualties against his force of about 2,000 were about 15%. But the problem was that there had been no noticeable assistance from the rear. He was going to have to fight on with these men, many of them near exhaustion, for example. His assistant regimental commander and adjutant Lieutenant Colonel Tanaka was so tired that each night he collapsed in his foxhole and slept like one dead by November 13th. The Americans had 34,000 troops ashore on Banville. The Japanese had strong defences up north around the Bua airfield, but these showed no indication of coming south to fight against the Torokina beachhead. The Japanese also had strong defences in the south, about 11,000 troops, but these had not moved from their prepared positions. The Americans were facing only Colonel Hu's 23rd Infantry Combat Team. What was left of the 1,000 men who had attacked the beachhead's flank on November 7th, and the remains of the Torokina Defence Force General Gurr saw as his major task the building of the airstrips. But before this could be done, the area around their proposed sites had to be cleared of Japanese, and roads had to be built for supply of the front lines, as it was 2 weeks after the invasion. The only way to the front was via the narrow P Trail, which met several other trails upland. A man wounded at the front might require the assistance of a whole squad of men to get back to the beach area hospital. The Japanese south of the P River had no such luxury. They were a long way from their base, and with every engagement, every skirmish, there were fewer of them. Between the 14th and 16th of November, the survivors of No. 5 Company of the 54th Infantry straggled into Colonel Hu's camp. They were pitifully few, all the officers were dead, and only 16 enlisted men still lived on November 17th. What was left of the 54th Infantry's No. 6 Company arrived with the remainder of the 53rd Infantry's No. 6 Company, 23 soldiers with 2 machine guns on the night of November 16th. The 5th Convoy for Cape Torina was moving toward Enville. Another force of destroyers moved up to Booker to bombard the Japanese Army airfield. Both of these reports were radioed to Rabaul and brought instant action. The reinforcement flotilla consisted of 8 tank landing ships and 8 transport destroyers, carrying Marines to Banville, accompanied by 6 protective destroyers at sunset. A Japanese seaplane scout had sighted the force, which it misidentified as containing cruisers and aircraft carriers. The reinforcement flotilla was approaching Torokina and had nearly reached Moopa Point at about 1 o'clock in the morning, when 9 Japanese bombers and 5 torpedo bombers found them and prepared to attack. But the visibility from the air that night was bad, and the Japanese pilots attacked one by one over about a 4-hour period. 1 torpedo plane got through to the transport destroyer. McKen and put a torpedo into her. The torpedo set off an explosion in the magazine and depth charge storage area. It was very quickly apparent that the ship was finished, and many of the Marines aboard began jumping over the side. This turned out to be a fatal error because nearly all of them were caught in pools of oil burning on the surface and burned to death. Lieutenant Commander Ralph L. Rye, the captain of the destroyer, moved her out of the area of the burning oil and then ordered the passengers and crew to abandon ship. The men then went off. The captain last. 3 other destroyers stood by and picked up survivors. Although the Japanese attack was still in progress during the rescue operation, the McKinn sank and altogether 52 Marines were lost. Plus 3 of the officers of the McKinn and 61 men, the Japanese pilots went back to Rabaul to claim that they had sunk 1 large carrier, 2 middle-sized carriers, 3 cruisers and 1 warship of an unidentified type. They reported the loss of 4 land bombers, Bettys, and 1 torpedo bomber. These claims were made with great vigour, for example, referring to the big carrier. The Japanese could have said simply that it was sunk, but no, the report came in that it go in Scheititer. It sank immediately, and there could be no doubt about it. On the basis of further scout reports, another force of 55 torpedo planes and 10 dive bombers left Rabaul early on the morning of November 17th. When they came back, minus 6 torpedo bombers and 4 dive bombers, they reported having attacked a large group of transports and sinking 3 transports, forcing 1 to run around after a near miss, leaving 1 destroyer dead in the water and burning and shooting down 2 Allied planes. Both reports were transmitted to Imperial General Headquarters that day, and as usual Imperial General Headquarters accepted them without question and issued a communique which was then broadcast by Radio Tokyo, since there were no carriers on that side of Banville that day, and since the only warship or transport sunk that day was the McKinn, the Allies found it hard to understand what the Japanese were talking about. As with so many of the Japanese claims, reality seemed elusive. For whatever damage it did in Japanese planning, only the Imperial General Staff was to blame. Admiral Yamamoto had seen this coming from the day after the disastrous Battle of Midway, when Imperial General Headquarters had trumpeted a victory in spite of his truthful report of the affair. He told his Chief of Staff that it would be disastrous in the end. But as the war worsened for Japan, the Imperial General Staff grew ever more impervious to advice and criticism. Such ridiculous reports were now the norm on Banville. Little by little, the Marines expanded the perimeter, moving up land and to the east of the Torina beachhead. On November 17th, they occupied a Japanese roadblock on the Numa Trail that had apparently been abandoned. They moved in, and the Japanese decided to come back, found the Marines, and a fight ensued. A number of Japanese were killed, and the Marines held the position. Colonel Hu's 23rd Infantry was now being forced back south along the east-west trail, and the main body was dug in approximately a mile from the Torokina River, but the Japanese advanced parties were far to the west. On November 19th, the Marines cut the Japanese line of communication by capturing a promet known in Marine history as Keck Ridge. After Lieutenant John Teach of the 3rd Marines, he led a platoon on patrol, found the ridge which had been used as an observation post by the Japanese, and took control. The Japanese attacked on November 21st. But the Marines held on the 22nd and 23rd. The Japanese attacked. But still the Marines held, and by the end of the 23rd the position was consolidated, and the line brought up with it. The Japanese were in deep trouble. They had lost Loost, their point of observation of Empress Augusta Bay. A number of troops were cut off on the west and had to either make their way up around the lines or try to fight through the Marines, were building pressure along the Numa Trail toward the main Japanese position Aride. That trail, Colonel Hu's force, was by now down to about 1,500 men on November 23. The 3rd Marines planned a major attack on the Japanese, who were located on both sides of the east-west trail. To prepare, they did what Colonel Hamu hated most. They brought up 7 battalions of artillery that were programmed to fire a 20-minute barrage the next morning into an area 800 yards square. They would put several thousand rounds of 75 mm and 105 mm high explosives into. That small area behind were the 155 mm guns and howitzers that were prepared for firing on the Marines. had 44 4-machine guns a ride, a dozen 81 mortars and 9 60 mortars trained on the area H hour, was set for 9 o'clock on the morning of November 24th. It was for the Americans' Thanksgiving Day, for 23 minutes before H hour. The artillery fired 5,700 rounds into the Japanese positions. It was the greatest artillery barrage yet delivered by the Marines in this war. However, Colonel Hamu had finally gotten some help. His messages about the devastating power of the American artillery had brought from the 6th Division some artillery support, and as the Americans fired at the Japanese positions, a single Japanese 75 battery fired up and down the American line. This successful use of artillery by the Japanese, said the official Marine history of the Banville campaign, seemed to the Marines the worst feature of the entire fight. They were getting a taste of what the Japanese had been taking for 3 weeks, but just a taste, for in the middle of barrage and counter-barrage, a Marine artillery observer up front spotted the Japanese battery and directed the guns of the 4th Battalion of the 12th Marines onto the position. A handful of shells knocked out 2 of the guns and silenced the Japanese battery. At H hour, the Marines advanced. But instead of facing the usual hail of fire from Japanese machine guns and rifles, they found themselves in a zone of silence. The only Japanese soldiers they saw were dead, and the Japanese positions had been completely knocked out by the artillery. The Marines advanced 500 yards before the enemy was able to offer any resistance. Colonel Hamu had committed some reserves by that time, and they fought fiercely, launching a flanking counterattack against the Marine left. The 3rd Marines' 3rd Battalion bore the brunt of it. The fighting started with more Japanese artillery fire. It was worrisome to the Marines, and effect fighting then dropped into a hand-to-hand pattern, with Marines and Japanese killing each other for possession of individual trees and declivities. In the end, the Marines destroyed the effect of the flanking force, and the surviving Japanese moved back. The frontal force also moved ahead against strong Japanese opposition. The mortar platoon worked hard to plaster the Japanese positions, and they succeeded. The mortar was the key weapon, because the Japanese were really dug into a virtual maze of slit trenches, pillboxes, and foxholes that were mutually supporting, but the artillery and the mortars did the job for the riflemen. The Marines reached their destination. The 23rd Japanese Infantry melted away before them, and again on November 25th the Marines moved forward in attack again. The artillery softened up the ground for them. The Marine line extended around Kick Ridge. The Japanese defence position was atop of Promet. The Marines were to call Grenade Hill. There the Japanese had accomplished overnight. Another of their brilliant defences, some 70 Japanese soldiers were dug in on the ridge with 4 heavy machine guns, a number of light machine guns, and lots of grenades. Thus the Marine name for the hill. The Marines surrounded the position completely and tried to work their way to the top, but no matter from which direction they came, as they reached the summit, the Japanese began throwing grenades with considerable accuracy, and the Marines had to fall back all day long. The battle continued, and at the end of the day the Japanese still held Grenade Hill. But that night the Japanese moved out, and the next morning the Marines moved in without opposition. The next day the Marines moved forward along the line and straightened it out. They had accomplished their objective, and now controlled the trail to the Torokina River. For the next 4 months the Japanese would try no more than to put patrols across the river. The Americans controlled the heights of Othere Beachhead, and the site that was to become the P bomber field. Since this was what General Gear wanted, the Marines dug in, and a few days later turned over the area to the United States Army's 14th Corps. By this time, the 23rd Japanese Infantry had taken a tremendous beating, the Marine figure, for the total number of Japanese dead, since D-Day was 2,000, that had to include the casualties from the 300 original defenders and the 1,000 men brought from Rabaul to attack the beach. But the vast majority of the dead were men of the 23rd Infantry. The 1st and 3rd Battalion of the regiment were in tatters. The 2-pronged attempt to strike the bridgehead had failed miserably. The Americans were ensconced on the beachhead in great strength, and there was no way the situation could be reversed by moving along the mountain trails from the south. Colonel Hu's campaign was over. As if to emphasize the change, on November 24th, the first United States plane landed on the fighter strip down by the beach. Although it was premature, Marine Captain J.C. Richards's dive bomber had been damaged by anti-aircraft fire in a raid on northern Banville, and he had to put down somewhere the strip held up, and the plane was safe for all practical purposes. The Americans had their first airfield on Banville, and it was just a question of time before planes would begin operating from there. Against Riebel, the Americans did not realize, however, that the 23rd Regiment was about to pull out of the area. They worried about a force coming up along the south side of Empress Oster Bay to somehow reinforce or link up with the colonel, and without sufficient intelligence to justify it, they planned a raid inside the Japanese lines on the southern side of the bay to destroy communications and supplies. The trouble probably lay in the failure of the Allies to convince the Buonvillans, as they had the natives of Guadalcanal and the Central Solomons, that the Allies and not the Japanese were going to win the war on Banville. As noted, the Allies did not have the advantage of a friendly native population that could have warned them against precipitate action to the south. On November 23rd, the 1st Marine Parachute Battalion arrived at Bugville, and General Geiger decided to send them in to make the raid to the south, along with Company M of the 3rd Raider Battalion, and several specialists and native guides. Major Richard Fagan was in command. He was to land on a beach about 3,000 yards northwest of Chiari. No one knew much about the beach except that it was there, and the native guides were useless, and no one knew how many Japanese were in the area or where they were. Fagan's mission was to establish a base and then send out raiding parties as far inland as the east-west trail. If he encountered any large force of Japanese, he was to retreat to the Torokina beachhead at 3 o'clock on the morning of November 29th. The parachute force loaded aboard landing craft, and an hour later was landed on the coast at Kauari Beach. They were greeted by a Japanese officer who marched out from the jungle and began a conversation with the incoming Marines. He was wearing his sword, but it was scabbed, and he obviously was expecting Japanese reinforcements, not Americans. The moment an American spoke, the Japanese officer ducked back into the jungle and was gone. The Marines moved fast. Soon they had a beachhead 350-yard wide and 180-yard deep, but this did not include the 3rd Raider Company, which had been landed about 1,000 yards east of the other troops. Within a few minutes firing began. It soon became obvious that the Japanese force ahead was large. In fact, Major Fagan had stepped into a hornet's nest. He had arrived in the middle of a Japanese supply area. The 3rd Raider Company was cut off, and they began to fight their way up the beach toward the rest of the force. But it was costly, and by the time they arrived at 9:30 in the morning, they had suffered 13 casualties. The parachute troops were also under fire. Major Fagan was in touch with Torokina until his radio receiver went out, and from that time on it worked sporadically. At dawn, the Japanese attacked. They used 90 mm mortars and heavy machine guns. The Marines were pinned down on their beachhead. They fought off the attacks, but as the morning on these continued and became more fierce by 8 o'clock in the morning, Fagan had decided that he was in real trouble, and that if someone did not get him out, all of them were liable to be killed. He sent a message back to General Geiger asking that the landing craft come and pull them out of their predicament. Obviously the landing craft would have to have some support. General Geiger agreed, and he proceeded to instruct Fagan in his next steps. But the message did not get through, so the Marines dug in and waited. The Japanese attacked and attacked again, and the Marines fought them off, but after several attacks their ammunition supplies were diminishing rapidly, and Fagan wondered whether they would last through the night if the attacks continued. Meanwhile the landing craft came back and tried to get in to take the men off, but every time they approached the shore, the Japanese laid down a heavy mortar barrage and drove them off. However, Major Fagan had another weapon, that artillery again.